All right. Yeah, welcome from my end as well. I have to tell you, I've never been to a meeting that was all about tracking. But for 8 years, I built a company that was all about tracking. So you cannot imagine how exciting this is. A word of warning, Simon said that we can be a little bit nerdy. So let's see between Adrian and me, who's the bigger nerd. So yeah, like Simon said, feel free to kind of ask any questions. We will after have some time. And don't hold back. I can also handle the technical stuff. And yes, do feel free to challenge me on that. All right. Really getting started talking about tracking. And I mentioned it already. I run Parcel Perform. We have specialized on aggregating tracking data across more than 1,000 different carriers on the last mile across 160 different markets. Many might ask, 1,000 carriers, how many are actually out there? We think it's about 1,800 relevant last mile carriers in the world. So we did quite a bit already to make sure that we can standardize their data, but there's still a lot more to do. You spoke about numbers as well, maybe one number to give you a bit of a feel on the kind of data complexity that we're dealing with. We have about 120 million parcel updates in our system every day. And that's a lot of e-commerce parcels, but also a lot of consumer-to-consumer parcels as well. But let's talk about tracking, and I think that's why everyone is here, and maybe to ease ourselves in a little bit of a picture here. If we think about the world of tracking, things could be relatively simple, we could argue, because you could say, okay, there's a delivery company that's delivering a parcel to my house. They sort of sent me a notification. It's actually pretty simple, right? We should know what's going on. We should know, and the whole topic of port piracy, they theoretically should be in a stage to update me. But, and I think most of you will also know this, the reality is a lot more complex because on the one hand, you don't just have one delivery company delivering parcels, but we at least see more than 1,000. And you have a lot of customers that are not just delivering one parcel from one delivery company, but are actually waiting for a lot of deliveries from all this delivery company at once. Pretty complex, a lot of information flying around, and we made it our mission to bring a lot more clarity in this whole kind of vast majority of different information flying around. Now, if we then at the same time look at the challenges that this poses, if we look at just the carriers that are out there worldwide, the interesting thing, and something when I worked at DHL really bugged me because I tried to build the global tracking platform there, is there's no global standard for delivery tracking. There's no common description on how you describe the parcel, the status of a parcel. Yes, out for delivered could be, yay, your parcel is in delivery, hey, it's about to arrive on your home, but they all mean the same thing. Yet the industry never agreed on a common standard to describe this data. The second thing here is that with no standards, you have every carrier, every shipper out there, anyone describing the journey of parcels in a very different manner, even though delivery is not that hard. It gets picked up somewhere, it's in transit, maybe there's a bit of customs, then it's out for delivery and it's delivered. But with everyone describing this in a very different manner, and on our end, we actually saw more than 500,000 different events to describe something that should actually be relatively simple. We have to find a way to standardize this data to make it understandable, but also to make it interpretable. And we're not just talking about events when we speak about tracking, and I think most of you know this because it's not just about what happened to a parcel, it's also equally important where the parcel actually is. Well, another big problem because everyone describes this very differently as well. So we made it our mission to standardize this data and make sure everyone knows what it means, but also everyone can put it on a map. Last aspect here, also a really interesting one. When we first started my business, I built it in Asia first. Now in Asia, everything comes from China. I lived in Singapore. I didn't understand a thing. Then if a retailer, Alibaba, you mentioned it, we work with them as well, is trying to standardize the data, they get it in the wrong order because there's heaps of different time zones involved. We have a lot of business also in Latin America. Mexico has 3 different time zones. How do you decide which order the updates should actually be? So all this is a lot of complexity that we have to deal with when we talk about parcel tracking. It's not just about the event description, it's also about the languages, the time zones, and then it's about how clear the communication actually is, and whether we put it on the right channel, because we need to make sure that end consumers are actually getting it. On the flip side of this is a market where everyone actually wants to know. So when we look at the statistics, and we also provide tracking pages, usually integrated into web shops. If you shopped at Nespresso or Mr. Specs or My Theresa, they basically embed this data within their web shop with our help. And actually, customers are checking more than we think. I don't know how many of you, just before Christmas, was like desperately trying to find out whether you can still wrap the gifts and put it under the Christmas tree. And on average, especially for international parcels that take quite a while, people check 4.6 times. For any retailer, that's 4.6 times the opportunity to engage with an end consumer and potentially sell even more. So that's a huge opportunity. So getting this data right is just so meaningful for every player in the market. Now, the big question is, how do we do it? And without being too nerdy, we try to structure the process into 4 simple steps. That's sort of the USP that we have as a company. The first step, and it sounds easy, but it's actually really damn complicated, is that you have to integrate with, in our case, more than 1,045 different carriers across 160 markets globally. That means multiple integrations with every carrier, because the API have rate limits, the SFTPs sometimes don't work, and so on. That's the first important step. The second step is that we now have to harmonize the data. We have to interpret the events, the time zones, the locations, and so on. The third step is where I believe the magic happens, because this is the step where you take all the data that's out there and you try to make it meaningful. In our case, one of the applications I want to talk about is how we can actually predict when a parcel arrives before the carrier picks it up. Because the most meaningful point of accurate predictions is in checkout, because that's when you decide whether you're going to shop there or not. And then, of course, we need to make this data available. That's probably the easier step. But those 4 we have to get right. So for my presentation today, I want to quickly guide you through these 4 steps and give you a bit of a flavor of this. The first step that we're doing on our end is, of course, to integrate with all the carriers. But one thing we often overlook is it's great that you have all last mile data. If you don't connect this to an actual order and to an actual customer, it doesn't do the trick, right? Because people happen to want to know what's inside the box. So as we developed Parcel Perform, we quickly realized it's not just about having access to last mile data, but it's to make sure that we connect all the dots. And that starts with a successful order, with payment information, but that also incorporates that we incorporate all details from the warehouse. Because if you look at drop shipping in China or peak times where things take longer in the warehouse, this is where your customers get the most nervous. This is where you need to be able to actually provide updates on what's happening in the warehouse while you're waiting for the carrier to tell you what happened to the shipment overall. So that's the very first step that we're taking. And we do this, of course, with like multiple integrations, but that's still the easier one. The more complex one is then for us to harmonize this data. And I mentioned it before, it gets really tricky when you look at locations. The very first market we decided to launch with one of our big customers, Nespresso, was Thailand. And I wondered, why did they give us Thailand of all places? Turns out Thailand doesn't have postal codes. The description of a location is the door on the right, you take 2 steps, and then you go up the 4th floor. Try standardizing that, but we have to, because the delivery driver still has to get there, and the porch pirate shouldn't find the parcel, and the end consumer needs to know where it is. The second step here, also equally important, is to, of course, standardize events. Now, believe us, we tried this with AI, and it's getting better and better, but parcel delivery is so ambiguous. Something is in a sorting center, might be loaded in a truck. So we're actually manually double-checking and doing quality control of all of our events. So we have a master data team that is checking every single ambiguous event. Then we have the time zones. So you got to figure out where it actually was. If it crossed the border, you need to neutralize the time zones. We need to deduplicate the events. It gets very complicated. And then we actually have to translate it, in our case, in 36 different languages. The last language we just translated to was Khmer. If anyone knows where that is, we reached a few edge cases already, so we need to look for the next language to translate to. Third step, and this is, like I said, for me, the most exciting one. Because we talked about making sure that you have all available data sources ready. So you have the order events, you know something about the customer. Best case, you know what happened in the warehouse. Not everyone does, but we're trying to. And then you can track the last mile events. The key thing here is the EDD. And the great thing is that more and more carriers actually provide you with an EDD. They provide it at the moment they picked up the shipment, because that's the first time they can tell. And then later they provide you with an EDD the moment it's out for delivery, which is super important and great because they usually give you a time frame. Now, us as an end consumer want to have an EDD when we buy the stuff, because that's when we decide whether it makes sense to pick the express delivery service, whether we rather want to go to the store. So we looked into this, and we obviously have heaps and heaps of data to work with, and realized that in order to really fulfill that customer demand of actually knowing when the parcel will arrive before checking out, best case on the product pages. And by the way, there's one company that does this very well, and I know we all often don't want to talk about it, but it is what it is. Amazon does a pretty good job. You go there, you know you have Prime, you get it within a day, and that's one of the main reasons why they actually tell you. In fact, they did a study, and they increased their checkout conversion rate by 21% by giving an accurate EDD. That's an accurate date for the delivery. Imagine how much revenue that is for all the retailers out there. But unfortunately, they can't ask the carrier because the carrier doesn't even have the parcel yet. So how do we get to an accurate EDD on a product page or on checkout? And that's what we looked at. And obviously, a lot of the beauty in there, and I see you smiling because you're probably tackling the same thing. And looking forward to hear that. But yeah, the whole beauty is in having enough data and have a model that has enough data to train on and to understand all the variables to make sure that you have a very accurate way to predict the ED. Now, you said we can be a bit nerdy, and there's one thing that I might want to add to this. When we talk about accuracy of EDDs, a lot of carriers say, oh, well, we are very accurate. Well, yes, if you're very conservative. So the non-late accuracy is the biggest question. What does that mean? Is if I say the parcel arrives latest in 10 days on a Friday, that is very accurate because likely the parcel arrived before that. Fantastic, we all have a great EDD. Still a terrible customer experience because even if you bring it earlier, the customer might not have been at home. So as you develop your AI models, you have to have a day accuracy to make sure it's the actual day the customer expects this in. And very happy to say we have rolled this out with quite a few customers on our side and also very big brands here in Germany. And they luckily could see also similar checkout conversion rates like the one that I just mentioned for Amazon. So big game changer in the industry. And I just want to say this again, we cannot put it on the carriers because they can only predict the EDT by the time they have the parcel. So there's got to be solutions out there that connect the parcel industry to the shippers to make sure that it actually works. Last but not least, also very important, I think if we talk about parcel tracking, everyone is talking about latency. Really big topic, also something very, very big for us. We got to make sure that we keep all the data updated, that we connect all the data points. And this is also where we see huge opportunities for AI. In the past, we had rule-based models on when to look for data updates. And by the way, you got to be very careful because some of the data backends on the giving side of information might not be able to take the load well. So it's also our responsibility to do the load balancing, to ask at the right time, something that we take very seriously. But the exciting thing is now that with the help of AI, we can actually ask at a much better time, at the highest likelihood when we get parcel tracking updates as well. All right, that's almost coming to the end. You might be wondering, what do we now do with all this data that we're aggregating? On the one hand, we work with a lot of retailers out there, so they want to update their customers, they want to send notifications, they usually want white label notifications, so it doesn't matter so much which carrier delivers it, because you give your money to a retailer, so you sort of want them to keep you updated. There's a lot of exciting stuff we can do with good tracking updates also for those retailers. At the same time, we want to give it to the shippers, because if we are very accurately analyzing this data, we can not only see SLA compliance, but we can actually see which depot has an issue, which pickup time and cut-off time maybe by your retailer doesn't work out, because they always give it later to you but blame you for being late. So there's a lot of collaboration we have with the carriers and the shippers to make sure that we get actionable insights from this data as well. And then IT is giving up, but we also wanted to highlight that this is obviously a big one also for developers, making sure that they get the data in real time as possible, and therefore we try to do it via APIs and webhooks as much as possible. So with the help of that, and that's my very last slide, what are we trying to do? Tracking data can sound very nerdy, and I also really like it that way, but I think the real impact goes through the user journey. And the real impact of tracking data can already start on the product pages and at the checkout, because that's the first time when it matters what's going to happen to your shipments. The tracking data then is a central touch point to the relationship with the end consumer. Of course, very brand building for many, but also making it very actionable. It's then an amazing opportunity to engage, to kind of represent your brand, but also to get feedback from your carrier. Then it has a big point also on returns, something that I didn't manage to talk about today, but of course, tracking on returns is very important. We just need to be careful. It's a different kind of tracking. Your customers don't care where the parcel is. They care when they get the money back, but it's still an event that we have to relate to them. And of course, if we want to make the industry better and we want to help everyone to understand where there are opportunities to improve, and having this data will really drive operational differences as well. That's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Dana, stay with us for a while
Yes,
for
sure.
Some questions. I'm sorry. All right. I'll take some questions from the audience. Does this microphone work? Yes. Cool. Dario.
Hi. Yeah, first of all, nice presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering, you've explained that you have successfully implemented your solution with more than 1,000 different companies and retailers. And you've also talked, of course, about how important it is to always receive all the event updates for all the parcels which are being delivered. So I was wondering which kind of approach works for all these 1,000 different companies. Like, can you get all the potentially scan events from different carriers, or which kind of approach can work with all these different markets and time zones? How do you deal with this?
Yeah, so the opportunity for us is there's not a single approach, which makes it really hard for everyone else to figure this out. Every carrier has their own infrastructure, and some carriers are still a little bit in Stone Age when it comes to that. So you see quite a few SFTP file exchanges. And I used to make jokes about them, but in times of peak, they come in very handy because they don't have rate limits. So we sort of like them. So you still get an update if any API doesn't work. Obviously, most of the carriers, especially internationally, and we see a lot of new carriers coming up in Asia, where we have a lot of business as well, usually work with APIs, which is very helpful. Our favorite, and I think the best solution for the entire industry, would be to move to webhooks, because it makes sure that you get the information when there is an update and you don't put load on other systems to constantly ask whether there is actually an update in place. So we believe that's the most efficient method, but we also don't see many carriers doing that yet. So there's a reason why we have about 120 developers that make sure that we have all these carrier integration up.
Another question.
One question about what I would call the shipper integration, which shows the EDD, as you said. Did you also try something with what I would call premium time frame upgrades, or something where the customer is able to select a specific time frame and pays extra?
Yeah, we would love to. So we obviously handle the technical side of that. For this, we would need the carriers to provide that as a service. And some carriers do, but then it's usually a service embedded on their website, so we can embed it as a link and then link back to the carrier page to then upgrade. But that's obviously not great for many retailers. So we see only very few carriers for now that have this as a sort of API-based service that we could embed in our services. I see a lot more of that in Asian carriers. Ninja Van in Singapore, for example, does a pretty good job. And maybe, I don't know if Uber Direct has a different update for us, but those newer solutions sometimes have a tendency to make this available faster. At the same time, we of course understand the carriers, because to do that, you have to have the operational processes to support it, and that can get very, very messy.
Thanks. I'll take a question from remotely. One question from Charlotte is, can you think of any tracking data that you wish you'd have, but which is not available from the carriers?
I mean, every carrier really has, okay, the biggest one for, if I can dream, is CO2 emissions, because that's obviously, that's a key decision factor for many carriers, and frankly, for us, it's quite interesting because we see all these parcels, but we don't know what's the mode of transportation. So if we were allowed to help them and they would only tell us the mode of transportation, we sort of exactly know when it was picked up, how long it went. We see where, it's probably the same for you. So that would be super interesting. If we talk about US carriers, but also German carriers, we have a few that do pictures at hub, which is super helpful, so we can pre-alert even on the size of the parcel, because some customers, if it's big and bulky, you actually don't really want it in a parcel locker or parcel shop, because then you have to carry it home. So if we could have more information about that, that would be helpful for the customers. And then the picture at delivery location, I think, is also a big one. Port piracy, maybe to close the loop on that one. If every carrier were to just take a picture on where they actually dropped it and not just say, oh, it was delivered to the neighbor. But yeah, which neighbor? Where is it actually? So I think there's still quite a lot of improvement.
Okay, so you want a picture of the neighbor in the data? That's good. Yeah.
Do you have an insight that you can share about where you get the GPS data from? Like, is it mostly from phones or from telematics boxes or directly from OEM? And is there any trend that you see?
Yeah, very good question. I don't have a concrete answer. Also, I see a lot of regional differences. So we have a lot of providers like Lalamove, GoGoVan in Asia. They all have handheld devices, and they're usually connected to that. That has an incredibly high accuracy. People like Uber or Grab in Asia, they also have pretty high accuracies when it comes to synchronous tracking, which basically means that you constantly see what's actually going on. Whereas most of the carriers obviously usually have what we call asynchronous tracking, so they give us an event every now and then, but you could never draw a map, otherwise the parcels would fly through a city. So it really depends, there's no single answer.
Maybe one last question, yes?
Thank you for the presentation. We are dealing with the exact issue, so it was really nice to see that. I have a question, maybe for the return flow. So in our company, it's we also have we work with multiple carriers and stuff like that, and we often see that for some reason the return flow is always different. We don't get as many events. It's really difficult to deal with. So I'm curious if you also have those issues, and what are you, let's say, how do you approach those problems?
Yeah, I think a return question is difficult. I think most of us would know it's all a matter of negotiation and how much you're ready to pay, right? Because the return flow doesn't have an urgency to it. The carrier doesn't transport it as fast as they have to on the outbound. So it really also depends on your negotiation with the carriers. Maybe on the tracking side, one interesting thing that we're seeing is we obviously also track returns, and we actually do even the booking and facilitation of returns. But we see that a lot of end consumers, they really don't care that it's in a sorting center now, because for them, it really doesn't make a difference. What end consumers want to know is whether the return hit the warehouse, and best case, whether it was an accepted return, and then the cash remittance starts. So that's, again, our attempt to make sure that we don't just integrate last mile data, but we make sure we integrate other data sources too, to then connect it to give meaningful updates. And also to the retailers that we're working with, for them it also almost doesn't matter basically where the return exactly is. They need to know the reverse EDD. They need to know when the return hits the warehouse so they can start selling it again. So there's a lot of sort of pre-alerts, EDDs on an aggregated level that we are doing for our customers on the warehouse to make sure that they can prepare for the returns to come in and then can basically start selling it again.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. Thanks, Dana. Please applause for Dana and welcome, Adrian.